Wow.
He was calling in February to go in June, and I said, oh, honey, he barely got it.
No, it's 20 like full time. Ross always interested me. I always
always have everything burned. And everything ran in nature.
Program tonight, which is a little unusual in the way it's come about. I think it's a first for our society in that the presenters, Jeff Brashears and his associate Don Susko from Columbus, have come down on a private plane. Yes, they did. Dick and Strauss went to Springfield Airport. Yes, there is one. And they went on at 4:30, and then Ross Morgan is going to take them back to Springfield Airport, and they will fly back to Columbus after the meeting. And it's kind of interesting that they are here using a modern mode of transportation and using a computerized program here to talk about a subject which is in the past. So we have the new helping to tell the story of the old. And without further comment, I will comment one more thing. There's a lot we could say about Jeff and Don, and the company he works with is called Rail Van, V-A-N, Global Logistics. And I asked him to explain at supper tonight what it was all about, and it was very interesting, but I will spare a lot of that unless he wants to elaborate a little. But it has a lot to do with shipping trailers on flat cars on the rails. And he works out of Columbus, but the business he does is nationwide, even going into Mexico too, for shippers. So it's quite interesting. And I'm going to turn this over to Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I have a voice that carries, and I think I'm probably loud enough. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. I was going to offer my house. This house tour looks really neat. I love old things. That's obviously how I got interested in streetcars, because Don and I decided we would be the youngest people here. I collect antique cars also, and when I go to car shows, what you find at car shows are the younger people collecting the newer cars, because that's what they remember. Well, I think I'm probably interested in trying to preserve history. My house isn't old, but it's full of stuff. I collect antique clocks, I collect cars, I collect railroad stuff. In fact, this probably looks pretty neat compared to my house. My daughter was lying on, my 16-year-old was lying on the couch the other day looking up. I have very high ceilings in the house, and I have a picture of the Union Pacific buffalo. For those of you who've been around for a long time, you might remember that the Union Pacific's mascot used to be a buffalo. And this buffalo is hanging up on the wall, and Margaret says to me, Dad, you know, normal people have pictures of their family hanging in their house. We have a picture of a buffalo. And I said, well, this is one of our old ancestors. How many people here, probably most of you, have ridden streetcars? Okay, well, except for Cleveland, which still has Shaker, obviously, and the rapid transit, I haven't, but I was very lucky as a child. I grew up in Mansfield, Ohio. I guess it's lucky compared to what you compare it to, but I grew up in Mansfield, Ohio. And for those of you who know the technical part of the streetcars, we now know more than we did when we came in when we talked about a controller, didn't we? We were talking about that tonight. The Ohio Brass Company was responsible for almost all of the overhead, all of the trolley poles, all of the trolley collectors in the United States. And I had a person who was at my church, and she was the organist, and she worked there. And the person in their public relations department sort of adopted me when I was about 15 years old. And I spent a lot of time down there learning about histories of streetcars in Ohio. I think it's been very, very well spent. For those of you who read the Columbus Dispatch, you'll see that last week the Columbus voters turned down a light rail streetcar system in Columbus, Ohio. We all voted on that, and they voted to keep the buses, but they didn't vote to keep the light rail. And it's interesting to me that we've almost come full circle to the point where we need some kind of rail transportation because the cities are just too crowded with cars. And for those of you who've been around, you remember the automotive companies are really the ones that got rid of the streetcar lines. Everybody wanted to be in their own car. They didn't want to do public transportation anymore. So what I'd like to do tonight is, this is a huge subject, Ohio, because Ohio had more streetcar and interurban lines than any state in the Union. So we're going to try to key in on some of the first things that happened in Ohio. And I want to talk about the Ohio Electric and the Cincinnati and Lake Erie because they were very close to here, and probably the two premier traction lines, at least in the Midwestern states. I have written, and if you want to look up here, I brought some badges and things like that tonight. I have written 3 streetcar books, and I'm working on a 4th that's taking a very, very long time. About 5 years ago, an outfit in Chicago called the Central Electric Rail Fans Association asked me if I would write a book on Ohio. And I've started to write. I have 658 pages done. My idea is to use it as a reference on every streetcar line that operated in the state of Ohio, and it is a much greater undertaking than I possibly imagined, particularly for a guy that owns his own company. So hopefully in the next couple years I'll get to it, but it's just very, very time consuming. But I think before everybody was gone, and we were talking about this at dinner time, when I worked on the Columbus, Delaware and Marion streetcar line back when I was in college, the attorney for the company was still living. He lived in Marion, Ohio, and he was very, very helpful when it came to research. There aren't a lot of people around who either worked on the lines or still remember, and I'm trying to get as much of this done where I can authenticate the research material as possible. So rather than spending any more time, I'd like to talk a little bit about Ohio's street railway history, and if I go too fast or you can't hear me, please say something. I'm used to talking about railband up in front of large groups, and I don't want to assume that you know what's going on. So Don was kind enough to take material and put it on the computer because I don't know how to do that. And I spent the last 3 weekends working on what I thought you all might be interested in. What I'd like to do is read to you a quote from a book called The Electric Interurban Railways in America by a couple of professors by the name of Hilton and Dew. This is how I got my start back when I was 16. This particular reference material has been around for a long time, and it's a very, very excellent reference material. No state approached within 1,000 miles of Ohio's interurban mileage of 2,798 miles. No town of 10,000 was without interurban service, and the territories along the shores of Lake Erie and from Toledo south to Cincinnati had highly developed networks. Almost the entire system had taken shape by 1908, and virtually all of it had vanished by 1939. About half of the state's mileage had been abandoned by 1932. The geographical conditions that had brought forth the Ohio interurbans, which were well-populated farm areas devoted to diversified agriculture, numerous medium-sized cities and towns, and a very large number of rural villages, did not generate the carload traffic that saved much of the interurban mileage west of the Mississippi. In addition, by the 20s, most of Ohio's interurbans could not afford the physical modifications that would have enabled them to interchange freight with the steam railroads. And as you can imagine, if you were competing with a steam line, they fought and fought at the state public utility level not to interchange freight with Ohio's interurban lines. The Ohio interurbans were particularly homogeneous physically, with a single exception, which was the Scioto Valley Traction Company, all used an overhead trolley pole, and with another exception, the Hocking Sunday Creek Traction Company, all used low voltage DC power. Except for some of the Cincinnati, Columbus, and Wheeling suburban lines, all were standard gauge, which was the same gauge as the railroad, 4 feet 8.5 inches. Let's turn back the clock to February 10th of 1887, when the Mansfield Electric Street Railway was incorporated for the purpose of constructing a trolley line in Mansfield, Ohio. Remember, this technology was relatively new. In 1834, Thomas Davenport, a Brandon, Vermont blacksmith, built over 100 model electric railway motor cars which operated by battery power. In 1851, Professor Charles Page constructed a battery-powered locomotive that reached speeds of 19 miles per hour between Washington and Blandonsburg, Maryland. The contraption, as they called it, was far from practical, and some called it the electromagnetic humbug. Moses Farmer operated a car with a motor and dynamo, and then others, including Leo Daft and Charles Van de Poel, brought us to the threshold of the electric traction era by the 1880s. The construction of the first electric railway in Richmond in June of 1887 by Frank Sprague was followed by a wholesale electrification of America's animal and cable railways. But back to Mansfield. City Council gave the company permission and authority to begin construction on August 5th of 1887, and on August 5th of 1887, the first car made a trial run, the third streetcar operation in the United States. Remember I said that this early and untested technology was very, very strange, so the article printed in the Mansfield and Shield and Banner should be no surprise, and I quote, "The hooting and jeering which greeted each accident on the previous day's experiment was uncalled for and unmanly from those who indulged in it. Those who participated in it have not the brains enough to see that the gentlemen of the streetcar company are doing all they can to get cars running." The Mansfield line, which began regular service the next day on August 6, 1887, actually used a four-wheeled cart pulled along parallel wires called a trolley. Later, a single pole with a single overhead wire was substituted. The line was fairly expensive for those days. Cars, three of which were furnished by the fledgling St. Louis Car Company, cost $10,000. Overhead wire was another $45,000 supplied by Ohio Brass, and another $58,000 for laying the rail, engines, boilers, and miscellaneous costs. On the interurban side of the ledger, two early lines in Ohio were credited with being among the first interurban lines in the country. The first began in 1890 when the Newark Consolidated Electric Railway contracted with the Cleveland Construction Company to build an extension of their Newark line, which ended at Mound Builders Park on to the big city of Granville. The first car ran from Newark to Granville on August 4th in 1890, and by 1892, 10 cars were running, and the line was renamed the Newark and Granville Electric Railway Company. I might mention that there were grave concerns on the part of the shop owners in Granville that once the line was opened, all the citizens of Granville would take the interurban to the big city of Newark and make their purchases there. This was the first interurban line, by the way, in the United States to carry U.S. mail. The line was folded into the Columbus, Newark, and Zanesville, and then on to the Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern traction, which was leased by the Ohio Electric Railway. And I'll talk shortly about the Ohio Electric Railway. Probably a better candidate for the first interurban line in Ohio would be the Akron, Bedford, and Cleveland. The line was chartered on August 13, 1894, to construct a line between these three cities, but construction did not start until March of 1895, when roadbed grading began between Cuyahoga Falls and Bedford. The line followed Route 8 into Bedford and then paralleled Route 14 to Miles Avenue in what was to become Cleveland. The line entered Cleveland over a connection with the Cleveland Electric Railway, and by December 11, 1895, cars were running between Akron and Cleveland Public Square. The Akron, Bedford, and Cleveland was noted for a number of innovations early in the interurban era, establishing the right of eminent domain in the state of Ohio for interurban line construction. In other words, they could take your right-of-way to make their roadbed. Assistance in developing the air compressor, establishment of the substation system for transmission of power to electric interurbans, and telephone dispatching for controlling the movement of interurban trains. The last innovation was so advanced, the use of the telephone, that the government and the U.S. Telephone Company built a telephone testing station north of Silver Lake, near the location of the Akron, Bedford, and Cleveland's telephone dispatching center. On May 26, 1899, the newly formed Everett Moore Syndicate incorporated the Northern Ohio Traction Company, and on July 1 of the same year, the Akron, Bedford, and Cleveland was folded into the new company. I mentioned before the Scioto Valley Traction Company as an exception to the trolley pole system. This line, which ran from Columbus to Lancaster, Chillicothe, and Circleville, began its life on September 9, 1899. The line was built to steam road standards, in other words, they used heavy rail, and an outside third rail rather than an overhead trolley pole. On July 19, 1904, the first car operated from South Parsons Avenue in Columbus down to Lancaster, and hourly service began on July 21st with stops in Canal Winchester. Most of the operations were similar to steam railroads, and this line, after abandonment, continued to service what was to become the Columbus and Southern Ohio Power Company with 2 steeple cabs. In 1956, this 13-mile line was dieselized, and in the 80s, the line disappeared altogether. Moving around the state brings us to probably the 2 greatest traction systems created in this country: the Ohio Electric Railway, and then subsequently the Cincinnati and Lake Erie. The Ohio Electric Railway was incorporated on May 16, 1907, and the partners were Randall Morgan, a banker from Philadelphia, W. Kesley Schaff, owner and operator of the Cincinnati streetcar line, and Hugh McGowan, owner and operator of the Indianapolis streetcar lines. As a sort of side note, when one studies the history of the street railway and interurban lines in the state of Ohio, there were few players and a very few wealthy and influential men who controlled the lines. The Ohio Electric was incorporated, and I quote the Street Railway Journal, to build, own, operate, and acquire electric railways from Zanesville, Ohio to the Indiana state line near New Paris, and from there to Richmond, Indiana, Cincinnati, Columbus, Washington Courthouse, Springfield, Dayton, Defiance, Lima, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. The object of the incorporation was to merge all of the Schaff-McGowan interests together into one company. The 3 initial properties were the Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern, the Lima Toledo Traction Company, which included the Lima City Service, the Fort Wayne, Van Wert, Lima, and the Cincinnati Northern Traction Company. Included in this group as sublines were the Dayton, Springfield, and Urbana, the Columbus, London, and Springfield, the Columbus, Grove City, and Southwestern, the Urbana, Bell Fountain, and Northern, the Springfield and Western, the Dayton Northern, the Columbus and Lake Michigan, which actually started out as a steam railroad, and the Dayton and Muncie Traction Company between Greenville and Union City. They also leased the Dayton and Western and the Columbus, Newark, and Zanesville. The company had a capitalization, and this is 1907, of $115 million. Cost of the properties when they built them was $171,500,000. Income for the companies in 1907 was approximately $5 million, and the 57 companies operated under its control controlled a total of 2,648 miles of streetcar line. There were 4 operating divisions: the Western District between Dayton and Richmond and Dayton and Union City, the Central District between Dayton, Columbus, Springfield, and Lima, the Eastern District between Columbus and Zanesville and Columbus and Morgan's, and the Northern District, which was Lima, Fort Wayne, Lima and Defiance, and Lima and Toledo. A trip on a limited between Columbus and Zanesville, a distance of 64 miles, took 2 hours. And between Dayton and Indianapolis via Richmond, a distance of 100 miles, required 4 hours for a trip. Cars operated at 50 to 60 miles between the stops, and fare was $1.75 one way and $3.35 for a round trip. That is cheap. In 1908, the company completed the line between Lima and Bell Fountain and Lima and Toledo, and in 1909, Lima to Defiance was completed. The Lima to Defiance right-of-way had been the Columbus and Lake Michigan, a road originally started to be a steam line, which the company converted to traction. The Ohio Electric purchased unused right-of-way from the Wabash for entrance into Toledo. And while other interurban lines had to fight the heavy traffic to get into town, the Ohio Electric flew through town with only 4 grade crossings. In addition to the interurban service, the company provided city service in Dayton, Hamilton, Lima, Newark, and Zanesville. Limited, which was high speed in those days, service was added in 1909 between Toledo and Dayton, and you could travel that in 5 hours. Between Toledo and Lima, a distance of 72 miles, in 2 hours and 15 minutes, and between Columbus and Lima in 2 hours and 30 minutes. A trip from Columbus to Toledo took 5.5 hours with a 15-minute car change in Lima. So what we now do in 2 hours took 5.5 on a streetcar. By 1910, the Ohio Electric was carrying 23 million passengers annually, but could only eke out a $5,000 profit in a year. The next year, in 1911, it got worse. The company only made $1,600. When the Great Flood of 1913 hit, damage to the Ohio Electric physical plant was in excess of $2 million. The balance sheet would never recover. The breakup of the company began in 1918 when the Cincinnati, Dayton, and Toledo left the holding company and reorganized as the Cincinnati and Dayton Traction Company. Dayton south of Cumminsville was lost as 54 miles of the Ohio Electric's main line, and in 1920 the Dayton Western was turned back to its owners. In January 21, the Ohio Electric was placed in the hands of the receiver. B.J. Jones was appointed, and in 1922 saw the Ohio Electric relinquish control of their leased properties. The Cincinnati, Dayton, and Toledo operating south of Dayton reverted to its previous owners and was reorganized as the Cincinnati and Dayton Traction Company. The Dayton Western Traction Company was reorganized as the Dayton and Western Railway. The Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern, the Columbus, Newark, and Zanesville, and the Fort Wayne, Van Wert, and Lima all reverted to their original stockholders. The Lima-Toledo Traction Company was reorganized as the Lima-Toledo Railroad. At the end of 1922, the corporate charter of the Ohio Electric Railway was dissolved. We watch as 7 years go by until Dr. Conway, soon to be of the Cincinnati and Lake Erie, began to resurrect what was once many of the properties controlled by the Ohio Electric Railway. Conway stepped in the scene in 1929. Listen to information from an article that appeared in December 1929 from the Electric Railway Journal. The Cincinnati and Lake Erie Railroad, embracing lines of the Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern Traction Company, the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton, and the Lima-Toledo Railway, will coordinate the lines from Cincinnati to Lake Erie and from Dayton to Columbus as soon as the federal district court approval is secured, probably early in January. The announcement followed the purchase of the Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern properties by the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton at a foreclosure sale in Springfield, in which C.H. McClure, president of the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton, and a receiver of the Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern, acted as special master. A deed to the Lima-Toledo property will be made over to the proposed merged line upon receipt of approval by the district court. The purchase price of all these properties was $1,000 in cash. Now remember, they're all in foreclosure. It was $1,000, subject to assuming $2.5 million in obligations that these lines owed their bondholders. Cincinnati, Dayton, Springfield, Lima, Toledo, and Columbus are among the main points on the new line. On January 1, 1930, the Cincinnati and Lake Erie was formed through the consolidation of the Ohio Electric Company lease lines, which included the Columbus, Newark, and Zanesville, the Dayton and Western, the Fort Wayne, Van Wert, and Lima, the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton, the Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern, and the Lima-Toledo. And what this really means is they took all these companies that weren't making money 7 years before and put them all in a new company again, and we're going to take a shot and see what happens. The new company would be the longest straight line interurban railroad in the world. It covered 332 miles and ran from College Hill in Cincinnati to Dayton, Springfield, Lima, and Toledo, with through service to be offered in Detroit over the Eastern Michigan. Another branch connected Springfield with Columbus. The three operating divisions were responsible for day-to-day operation. We've got it now from 4 down to 3. Cincinnati, which covered Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton. Columbus, which covered Dayton through Springfield to Columbus, and the Toledo division, which covered Springfield up to Toledo. The lines were doomed from the beginning. All were insolvent and merged into a group when the Cincinnati and Lake Erie agreed to assume this humongous debt. 14 days after the merger, a warm spell fell over Ohio, causing the snows to melt and massive floods. This is January of 1930. From Lakeview to Russell's Point, the tracks were underwater and train service was halted. A small river in Ottawa near Toledo also flooded, ceasing Toledo service. On February 26th, 1929, 7 Mile Creek north of Hamilton flooded, ceasing service on the Cincinnati division. Team tracks were washed out in Hamilton and Middletown. The Mad River flooded and Enon was shut down, and the Mud River washed out a concrete bridge near Medway and shut down the Columbus Division. Buses were substituted in many areas. The Western Ohio and the Dayton-Troy Electric both huffed out, allowing cars to run over their line. It took until March 3rd before temporary service was restored over the entire system. As summer approached, Conway began spending money on upgrading the roadbed. Work was done between Dayton and Columbus, Big Darby Creek to Summerford, and on the north side of Lyman. Engineers began work on redesigning a new high-speed interurban car. Aluminum displaced steel was chosen, and 20 of these new cars were ordered from the Cincinnati Car Company. 10 would have express accommodations, and the remaining 10 passenger cars would have a lounge in the rear. 15 brand new freight motors to haul the carload business were ordered. With passenger business waning, cars were being converted to freight motors to handle the still profitable freight business, but a new car order in 1929 was unheard of in the interurban business. The freight motors were delivered early in February of 1930 to the Moraine yards. In design and experimentation of these new high-speed interurban cars, the companies that worked on the cars included the Western Electric Company, General Electric, J.G. Brill Car Company, the Cincinnati Car Company, and the Westinghouse Traction and Brake Company. During experiments on these cars, management believed that certain premises were clearly established. First of all, if you think about and most of you probably remember if you were back long enough, the old interurban cars, they were all heavy wood, they were very heavy steel underframe, slow, made lots of stops. Well, Conway believed that he could draw people back to the interurban line by providing high-speed service, so a new car was going to need to be developed to make that happen. He believed it was possible to build a car of aluminum and steel, which was light in weight, but would possess the necessary staunchness and rigidity for sustained speeds on level tangent track in excess of 75 miles per hour. He believed it was possible to obtain these results with low-level track using small wheels. He believed that all things being equal, a car of the low-level type would ride much better at high speeds than the conventional wooden interurban car. That the attainment of such high speeds was conditioned upon the condition of the motors, which would meet the track clearance. That with such high speeds, one of the problems was braking, and that the methods of braking additional to the air brakes must be employed. These new cars would be equipped with both air and magnetic brakes, interconnected so that the latter would come into use only after the air brake application approached the safe level of wheel friction. He believed that to attain such great speeds, the lines of the car were important. The roof must be as low as possible and consistent with proper ventilation and interior appearance, and the lines of the car would be such that they would not tend to float at high speeds. The car should be streamlined and the roof line should be designed to increase the traction at high speeds. The other issue that he studied was the ability of passengers to have an unobstructed view. Before we started talking tonight, when somebody was mentioning riding in an urban car, I said, "Did you feel safe?" And they said, "Well, of course. Back then there weren't cars and horses and people in every place." And I said, "Well, you think of the two things that always happen, no matter what streetcar line you read about, two things always happen. A, there were lots of accidents because they didn't have the dispatching that they have now on the railroads. And B, everything was connected by the electricity, so either the car barn, the powerhouse, or the passenger station was always burning down someplace." So Conway decided that on his cars, passengers needed to have an unobstructed view like they did in a bus. Because in a bus, a passenger could see all the way around, including out the front window. So he decided to open up the front of the cars by placing shatterproof glass in all of the front and rear sashes, so no matter where you sat, you could see out the front, the side, or the rear of the car, which I thought was pretty ingenious back during this time. The names of the new cars were to be selected from 1,211 entries provided by employees and their families. At the inaugural trip of each of the cars, the respective prize winners and their families were guests of the management. The Path News Agency, which I remember, everybody remember Path News Agency when you went to the movies? Path News Agency handled the car publicity, and shows were held throughout the system. An old coach from the Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern, and a new deluxe car were displayed with each other during the week of July 15, 1930. The tour included all the major cities: Cincinnati, Columbus, Dayton, Toledo, Springfield, Hamilton, Lima, Bellefontaine, Middletown, and West Jefferson. Thousands of patrons passed through the cars. Meanwhile, Conway also made plans to shorten running time because he believed speed was important. Schedules were rearranged to provide more frequent service and convenient departure times, and modern methods, in quotes, of selling service and developing service were employed. On the freight side, much traffic was interchanged with neighboring interurban lines, but Conway also realized that the dependence on the other lines was a problem, seeing the interurban was in its decline. The railway paralleled improved concrete highways, the National Pike between Dayton and Columbus, and the Dixie Highway between Toledo and Cincinnati. The Indiana, Columbus, and Eastern, and the Lima-Toledo lines, had already felt the full force of highway competition, both from auto and buses, as well as the growing motor carrier business. The motor bus lines acquired by the Conway interest in conjunction with the interurban properties were at once made competitive from a rate and transit schedule, making it possible for passengers to use either rail or motor, whichever they would choose. Motor bus and rail schedules were then coordinated. Dr. Conway became convinced that the only way to attract passengers back to the line was create new long-distance service. Cincinnati and Toledo, Cincinnati and Columbus, Dayton and Columbus, and Dayton and Toledo. On Sunday, July 6th, this new high-speed passenger service was inaugurated with observation lounge equipment. This consisted of 3 daily limited trains between Cincinnati and Toledo with connections to Detroit, 3 each way between Columbus and Cincinnati, and 2 additional deluxe trains between Dayton and Columbus. Publicity for the introduction of the high-speed car was the famed race staged by the Path News Agency between what they called the Red Devil and an automobile. The automobile jumped out to an early lead, but once the interurban car caught up, the interurban car ended up winning by 15 car lengths. At one point during the race, it was projected that both the car and the Red Devil were traveling in speeds at excess of 110 miles an hour. The Cincinnati-Detroit run was named the Arrowhead. The Columbus-Dayton run was named the Courier. The Cincinnati to Dayton, the Evening Star. And the Cincinnati to Columbus was the Fleeting Sun. The company management also felt that on many interurban lines, fares were too high. The public no longer compared interurban service with steam passenger service, but rather bus and their own personal automobile. Ticket prices were then set to the highest profit for the company, but low enough to attract passengers back to the interurban, thus maximizing load factors. On the Dayton to Columbus service, which paralleled the company's public bus offering, the new service actually attracted 12% of the passengers back to the interurban car off the bus and operated 15 minutes or 55 minutes faster than the bus line. Dr. Conway said the most important lesson to be learned from this experience is that high-speed, blue ribbon service has developed brand new business for the interurban. Traffic which theretofore had used neither the local rail service nor the company bus line. It is perhaps significant that on July 27th, the Big Four Railroad withdrew 2 trains, the east and westbound trips of the Senator between Cincinnati and Columbus, when this new interurban service was installed. The profit and loss statement, though, for the Cincinnati and Lake Erie was certainly disappointing. Gross revenues for 1930 were $2.5 million and profits were $29,000. This would be the last profit the company made. The only good news was that most of the rest of the lines in Ohio were still operating and were not making a profit. Little consolation for a company who wished to expand and grow their business. The birth of Piggyback, which is the business that we're in a rail van, or really container on flat car traffic, began on the Cincinnati and Lake Erie with a new operation called cargo transport. The engineers of the Cincinnati and Lake Erie designed large, demountable vans that can be loaded on a flat car or hauled around on a truck. Trucks handled these vans around, collecting and distributing less than truckload freight, then brought them to the Cincinnati and Lake Erie, where large gantry cranes at Cumminsville on O'Neill Siding in Dayton, and in Toledo near the freight house, would lift them on and off flat cars. 2 containers per car could be handled, so the cost was cut in half. Overnight service was provided between Toledo and Cincinnati, with second day into Michigan and Kentucky. Service began on January 16, 1931 with freight motor 642, and initially service was a huge success. But as the Depression neared and the economy trailed down, service was halted in 1935. The Cincinnati and Lake Erie began offering overnight service for salespeople between Cincinnati and Detroit. Cars left the Cumminsville terminal in the evening and arrived in Detroit early the next morning on the Eastern Michigan-Toledo Railway. Fare was $6.60, making this the longest, cheapest ride in interurban history. 1931 brought about the abandonment of many connections that were vital to the Cincinnati and Lake Erie. The Eastern Michigan-Toledo for Toledo-Detroit service, the Cleveland Southwestern, a line that ran between Columbus and Cleveland, actually Bucyrus and Cleveland. The group looked at the health of the Columbus, Delaware, and Marion, which was their connection, and shared the Rich Street Station in Columbus, Ohio, but it wasn't doing much better, and it would last until only 1933. Freight solicitors were sent to cover Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan with promises of cheaper rates and faster service, which they could use to compete with truck. During this time, a fight ensued in the city of Springfield between the Cincinnati and Lake Erie about running freight trains down through the middle of the city. And although they were allowed to continue, this fight with the lawyers continued for the next couple years. Management was also worried about the Dayton Western, the 38-mile line providing the connection to the Indiana Railroad. Earnings were low, and Valentine Winters of the Winter Bank in Dayton held the paper on the line and wished to cut his losses. Winters agreed to allow a receiver to take over the line and also allowed the Cincinnati and Lake Erie to take over the day-to-day operation of the company. Conway picked up 5 lightweight cars from the Cleveland Southwestern and replaced them the aging Dayton Western passenger coaches. The first 6 months of 1931 were financially dismal for the Cincinnati and Lake Erie, and layoffs began. Passenger revenue was down 31%, and freight revenue was down 9%. Shop gangs were reduced, and executive salaries were cut 10% to 20%. Hamilton and Lima city schedules were reduced to save money. Trainman crew salaries were cut 10%, and where there were 2-man crews with a conductor and motorman, they were now down to 1. Even with the drastic cost-saving measures, the Cincinnati and Lake Erie lost money in 1931. Nothing was going to make the American consumer, even towards the depths of the Depression, give up his automobile. Pleasure weekends on the traction lines were out. Riding around on your own personal car was in. On January 28, 1932, the Cincinnati and Lake Erie filed for receivership, and Conway and McClure, the line's general manager, were appointed to court receivers. Conway felt introducing even faster service would stem the tide, but high-speed cars number 413 and 414 were repossessed by the Cincinnati Car Company when the line failed to make their payments. Abandonments continued. On June 30th, 1932, the Fort Wayne in Lima, formerly the Fort Wayne Van Wert in Lima, was shut down. 2.5 miles of the city lines in Dayton were also shut down as unprofitable. Losses for 1932 were $618,000 on revenue of $1.6 million, or an operating ratio of almost 150%. For every dollar the company was taking in, they were spending $1.50 to run the line. Track maintenance was deferred, weeds sprouted up, ties and poles were only replaced when absolutely necessary, and no car painting was done. The once premier roadbed now looked like every other interurban line in Ohio, struggling to survive. In '33, the Hamilton city lines were abandoned to buses. Cars were taken to Springfield for city services, and losses that year were $45,000. This did not include the $250,000 the company was required to make a year in interest payments. 34 wasn't much better. The Springfield issue was finally settled in favor of the company, allowing their freight trains to run through the city. That was little consolation, though, after the money that had been spent on lawyers. Columbus decided that the Cincinnati and Lake Erie needed to pave the center strips on the streets where it operated. Flyer and express trains were slowed down to make more stops, and high-speed cars, once called the Flying Red Devils, now operated more like regular interurban cars. Losses continued in 1935, and the company now owed $2.3 million to its various creditors. Employment was down to 556 people, and gross revenue for the year was only $1.3 million. In 1936, the Cincinnati and Lake Erie had 3 major accidents which further eroded their passenger base. The last involved a motorman killed in an accident who was running for office in Dayton. This, for many, including the press, was the last straw. Questions were raised about the company's ability to provide a high-speed operation and still protect the safety of its passengers. On June 30th of 1936, the Dayton and Western was sold to Fidelity Company of Indianapolis, and they in turn turned the day-to-day operation of the company over to the Indiana Railroad. As the end of 1936 neared, management of the Cincinnati and Lake Erie began to feel the company was doomed. Conway began spending more and more time in Philadelphia on the Philadelphia and Western, still a successful and profitable operation. Younger executives of the line began pushing for joint rail-bus service. This brought into being the Cincinnati and Lake Erie Transportation Company, which began operating buses between Middletown and Dayton, paralleling the interurban line. Later in the year, the company received permission to operate buses south of Dayton. On January 17, 1937, the Ohio River again flooded from heavy rains, and all freight to and from Cincinnati was stopped. The Ohio River crested at 80 feet, and the steam lines in the city were also shut down. It took almost a month before the line reopened, but there were casualties. The Dayton and Western was gone and abandoned on May 9, 1937. On May 15th, the Lakeshore Electric trainmen operating from Cleveland to Toledo struck for higher wages, and the freight operation on the Lakeshore Electric was immediately shut down. On November 19, 1937, the last car operated between Toledo and Springfield, and this end of the line was shut down. Through service between Cincinnati and Columbus ended in March 1938. In June, freight service ended, and on June 15th, the Northwestern branch of the company was sold for scrap. On October 31, 1938, the Columbus Division, cited the famous race, passed into history. This left a single segment between Dayton and Mount Healthy in operation. It wasn't to last long, and this piece was shut down on May 13, 1939. The name Cincinnati and Lake Erie Railway was divorced from the company on February 27, 1940, when the word bus was substituted for railway. But it didn't all end there. The Dayton and Suburban Railway was created to operate 6.3 miles from Dayton to Moraine, and this lasted until September 27, 1941. The Cincinnati and Lake Erie Transportation Company replaced the streetcar operations with buses in Lima and Hamilton city service, as well as other over-the-road transportation. In 1945, the Cincinnati and Lake Erie Transportation Company was operating 94 buses over 519 miles, and in 1946, the company was taken over by Greyhound bus lines. There were other interurban lines, though, that held on longer through the end. The Columbus, Delaware, and Marion. This is a picture of the Redbird in Delaware, in Delaware, Ohio, at the freight station. Columbus, Delaware, and Marion held on as the Marion Reserve Power Company and switched coal electrically into the Marion Reserve Power Company until 1952 with these 2 freight motors. The Toledo and Eastern, an outgrowth of the Toledo, Port Clinton, and Lakeside, lasted till 1958, operating 10 miles between Clay Center to the Wheeling and Lake Erie, hauling dolomite with 5 Toledo, Port Clinton, and Lakeside cars. Columbus and Southern Ohio Electric operated streetcars in Columbus until 1947, at which time all city lines were converted to trolley coach. Cleveland City service lasted longer because of the war, and it was gone in 1953. The Scioto Valley provided switching service to the power plant in Obetz with 2 steeple cabs until 1956. when the 13 miles lines were dieselized and then abandoned. Now, as an end to this, we brought some pictures along of some, am I behind or ahead? I'm ahead. I'm fine. We brought some pictures along, some area pictures along. Unfortunately, the captions weren't copied, but we brought some pictures along of the local lines in and around the area. This is obviously the Dayton, Covington, and Piqua. Here's the Dayton and Troy. This is a picture, by the way, that I got. This was the first picture I ever got at the Ohio Brass Company. I'm not into accidents, but I just thought the picture was so neat because the bridge had collapsed, but the car was still hanging in one piece. Here's the Dayton Xenia. This is by the early 1900s, actually in the late 1890s, all of the cable railways except for the inclines and all of the horse car lines in Ohio were gone. This was Middletown, Ohio, and Middletown, Ohio issued a number of postcards, and if you could see it, it'd be down here, but it said rapid transit in Middletown. These postcards were sent all over the United States, and this was what Middletown considered their rapid transit. One of the streetcar lines in Middletown cut the line in two, so they had mule cars going east and mule cars going west, but if you were going between, and I believe it's the B&O station, and I can't remember what the other one was, but if you were going between the two stations, you had to get out of the car, lift out your luggage, carry it across the track, and then put it on another car to continue your journey down through town. And then this is the Springfield Museum. God bless you. I feel the same way. And that's all we have. Unless you have questions. As I mentioned before, I brought some badges and books up here on the table. If you'd like to take a look at them, you're most welcome. And if you have any questions that I can answer, I'd be glad to answer.
Sir, you were talking about the Cincinnati area, we call CNLE. You ran from Dayton down through Moraine, Muscatine, Miamisburg, Franklin, and Middletown. Okay. When did you say the last time that ran?
The last car? Hold on. May 13th, 1939, the last car operated in Mount Health.
It seems to me like it would have been late, maybe 40 or 41, because I was born in 28, and I was allowed to make a trip from West Carroll, where we lived. In fact, we lived on Old 25, and we had 2-lane highway, and then the traction rails. And then next came that was the Erie Canal, which they filled in, and we called it the park. We lived right across from that. But I was allowed to make this trip from West Carroll to Dayton to my dancing classes by myself. And that seemed like I was, maybe I was scared of that, I don't know. The thing I remembered most was the soot.
Is that right?
Because it was hot in the summertime and all this dirt comes flying in on you. And then it went from there, after the traction stopped, we went to what they call the Ohio bus line. You said it was brought by Greyhound?
In 46, it was, in 46, the Cincinnati and Lake Erie Transportation Company was bought by Greyhound.
Was that Ohio bus line?
I don't know, I can't answer that, but I can tell you that the Newark and Mansfield lines were owned by a guy in Newark, and they were called the Ohio Bus Company, so it may very well have been the same company.
The Ohio bus line ran, and because I know they had specials, like coming from Wright Pat into Dayton, and then they had, they had one bus that just dead ended in Moraine City because of Frigidaire, and
Right.
Be there and turn around and go back, and et cetera, but it was always the Ohio bus line, as far as I knew, it ran down there.
Which was also, Moraine was the site of the shops for the Cincinnati and Lake Erie.
Right.
Yes, sir.
I was going to say the Ohio bus line was owned by the Cincinnati Street Railway, and it was a separate company from Greyhound. So that's what the lady here is probably thinking about.
Well, I'm not thinking about it, I'm just asking whether it was owned by Greyhound.
No, it wasn't. It was owned by Cincinnati Street Railway.
The Cincinnati, the shop, who was the owner of, or one of the owners of the Ohio Electric, pretty much had, in my mind, the world by the butt, because he had the Cincinnati streetcar line, he had the zoological gardens, he had Eden Park, and he owned the company in Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Car Company, that built all the cars. So every piece that they touched for transportation, he owned. Yes, sir.
Before the motor buses and the automobiles, when it was competing with the rail steam locomotive passenger service, what was the advantage of one over the other?
Well, in most cases, the trolley line provided connections to cities where you couldn't go on the railroad between two. For example, and I'll use Shelby and Mansfield. Mansfield was served by the B&O and the Pennsylvania Railroad, and Shelby was served by the New York Central. So if you wanted to go between Mansfield and Shelby, you couldn't. You took the streetcar line, because on those two railroads there was no way to connect. And so what ended up happening was, in a lot of cities, you know, and I can't tell you the schedule because I don't know, but you couldn't go from you know, pick some place, Akron to, I don't know, Mansfield. It was much more complicated on the steam railroad than it was on the interurban line. It was just faster. But if you look at the control of the lines, some of these lines in the early 1900s were making as much as $5 million a year. Net, not gross. And before, when they were being developed between 1900 and I'd say probably until the automobiles got really popular, probably before 15, they were making a huge amount of money. And the people that owned them lived very, very well. In fact, the Pomeroy House, which from the Pomeroy Mandelbaum Syndicate from the Cleveland Southwestern, the Pomeroy House in Strongsville is now a restaurant, by the guy that controlled the Southwestern.
And did you say one place in there what their traction company was? It called the Dayton Traction Company?
Well, Dayton had a number of them: City Railway, People's Electric.
City Railway. My grandfather, when he was younger, was a conductor on City Railway.
I think in Dayton there were more separate streetcar lines that took longer to merge than any city in the United States. Yes, correct. Cleveland got their act together real early when they had the big fight with Mayor Johnson, and all the streetcar lines ended up being one. But Dayton went for a very long time before the companies got merged into one.
Didn't you say the streetcars stopped in Dayton?
I don't think I did, but I can tell you if you want to know.
No, I rode one, and that's what I'm thinking. I wasn't born until 34, so I didn't think.
Well, you're young.
Yeah.
You're very young. Well, let me see if I can tell you.
They changed the trolley
buses, yes.
after that, but.
47?
Okay, okay, I'll buy that. Because I was thinking it'd be like 42 or.
Yes, correct. As late as 45, there were still 70 streetcars operating in Dayton, Ohio.
Then they went from streetcars to electric buses.
Trackless trolleys. In fact, Ohio Grass was pretty much instrumental in making a lot of those conversions, because it still allowed them to sell the same stuff, the overhead stuff. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks also to Don Susko for coming.
Yes, thank you. Don put all this presentation together, so we really need to thank her.
I first got to know Jeff because he, well, it's a long story, I'll try to shorten it here. He wrote a monthly column for a little newsletter called Let's Go Cruising. And cruising thing is about, you know, drive-ins and cruising on Friday night and your street rod and all that. But he has this interesting rail history, trolley history little article in each month, and I got very interested in that. I was involved with that little magazine because Z-Bar can handle their advertising, and at the time they were putting advertising in, so I'd always see a copy of it. And somehow we got talking with each other by phone, and we sent him Next Stop Xenia, and I think he got some interesting information out of there that's helping him, and hopefully he's going to help us a little bit. Earlier this evening, he was looking at our display of photographs up here, a lot of the Joe Merriman photos, and he's very interested in getting some copies of those. So this research on the trolleys is going to help us. We're trying to help him as well. So it works both ways to everyone's advantage. Dick has a few items to share with us that I think overlooked when I was giving the announcement. So a few minutes for Dick here.
I hope I don't repeat the ones they did, but we did have a few items that we needed to dispose of, and through the session policy or deassession policy, we sent some to grad auctions, and there were some OH items we didn't feel that we went with the collection, and we returned some, worn out, beat up, and now we want to work on the upper second landing in the turret. Well, actually the third floor, do something with that. We have a few items, because we're always having people wanting to know what is up there, so we're going to try to create like an attic storage scene, so that we do get some use out of that. We will be having another personnel workshop that we've been working on this month, so get some volunteers and want to put your hand up now, or let me know after the meeting. And Joan, do you have anything you want to cover? Not, that's